Hello everyone, welcome back. Obviously I've spent the better part of the Sandrone banner basically yapping endlessly about God Miko. So now it's time I want to talk about Sandrone because obviously I actually went ahead and got her after trying her out in the trial and deciding, yeah, she's actually fun enough at least for me, so there we go. I assume most of y'all understand how Sandrone works, right? Well, I guess I'll just do a TLDR just in case. Sandy can enable Stellar Conduct in the first place, but don't worry if you don't actually want to get her. Odette and more importantly Cryo MC can do that as well. So next patch, all three will also be able to enable Stellar Swell, so we'll see how that turns out. Meanwhile, she's basically a charge attack character like Nicolette. Her general gameplay experience is just charge attacking and then using her skill to remove the overheat so that she can charge attack again. And also her charge attack, skill, and ult can actually do some direct Stellar Conduct damage. Next patch, they'll apparently also be able to do some direct Stellar Swirl damage, so get ready for that. Using her skill while you're at least halfway to overheat will actually do way more damage. And removing a full overheat with her skill will give you 10 stacks of this buff that'll basically make your ult do more damage. So now I've made sure that we all definitely know what Sandy is all about. I did in fact decide to do some testing of a few other team variations on my account, so before we get into all that jazz, I just want to remind you all to like the video and subscribe to the channel because as always, your support will help combat the YouTube algorithm. So when it comes to team building for Sandrone, obviously right now her options are quite limited. Not super limited though, since we did get a wave of stellar buffs for various other characters, including of course God Miko. Next patch, we will at least have Odette as an off-field cryo option, who can also give the team some stellar percent while she is off-field. But of course, most people have been asking the pertinent question, does Sandrone need Yae Miko? No. In that there are other Electro off-fielders that can fit in a Sandrone team. Namely Beidou, especially C6 Beidou, who got a buff to that C6 so that she can give Cryo and Electro Red Shred, which is actually making her quite unique in that regard. I guess the main caveat from my perspective is that despite the quality of life buffs that she got, I still find Beidou to be a little bit finicky to play. Now, if you were to ask me, does my Sandrone require C6 R1 Miko? Yeah, of course, the answer is going to be a resounding yes. Basically, look, the DPS loss from not having God Miko on my team is quite noticeable. So let's just say I am yet to really find a Miko-less variant on my account that can break the 100k DPS mark. Now, funnily enough, I've been getting into the mood of Rimegrass, despite Rimegrass not exactly existing yet. So if anything, my favorite Sandy team that I'd like to play against anything that doesn't require something stronger is with C5 Fav's Chi-Chi, C2 Kagura's Nahida, and of course C6 R1 God Miko. In fact, I can clear Dire Stygian Ball with this team, so it's pretty much as endgame ready for me as it can get. Your experience may vary because maybe you don't have C6 R1 God Miko. I think part of the charm of this team compared to the variety of other options that Sandy has available is that, well, everyone's kit actually works to their fullest extent. I love teams that actually make full use of everyone's kits. It's kind of why I'm a little bit finicky about teams that, let's say, have Escoffier there, but we're playing Melt, so we're like, why are you here? Meanwhile, Nahida and Miko have nice long ability durations, especially the Shrine of Maya being able to also buff Sandrone's DPS window, so that's kind of nice. Let's not forget that the Stellar Conduct field can also give us some Cryo percent and Electro percent. And then on top of that, any excuse to actually make Chi-Chi great is of course a plus. On top of that, having both Stellar Conduct and Aggravate around, for Miko in particular, means that she gets to use both the Electro percent and also the Stellar percent buff from her C1, which, comparing Rimegrass with what seems to be a more popular variant of Triple Cryo with Escoffier, well, Miko does end up doing a bit more personal damage, so having those Aggravates around does seem to actually help. The Escoffier variant just happens to be stronger overall because Sandy herself ends up doing about 32% more DPS, so despite C6 R1 God Miko obviously doing the lion's share of the team's DPS, the Sandy DPS buff does in fact matter. But either way, I just like Rimegrass, you know? And if the rumors end up being true that Rimegrass actually becomes a thing and isn't like a stellar thing, for example, instead it might actually be a natural expansion of the elemental system, should that be the case, then of course I think this team is already going to be ready and we'll be able to get quite a lot out of that, so fingers crossed. Like I said, Rimegrass isn't the strongest Sandrone team that I can make at the present moment. It is stronger than swapping Nahida for Beidou though, despite Beidou introducing Red Shred. Replacing the healer with Sucrose seems to be a bit better, getting me another 5k DPS. The rotation quickly turns into random BS go though, so perhaps I could have played it a little bit better, and there may have been times where I was definitely playing the team a lot worse. But I suppose it's because Sandy and Miko's direct stellar conduct damage is attack scaling, as well as all of their other damage actually, that Nicole ends up being a little stronger than Sucrose, at least in my experience. On top of that, one of the problems that I have found with Sucrose is of course the shorter buff uptime of 8 seconds, or I guess a little bit longer if you're using Sucrose's butterfly ult. So Nicole having a full 20 seconds team attack buff not only made the team far easier to play, but I ended up doing around 3k more DPS, so that's rather curious. As I mentioned earlier, slightly stronger still was actually running Escoffier instead of Nicole, but strangely enough that's exclusively because Escoffier on Golden Troop was doing some DPS herself. Both Sandy and Miko were actually doing less damage in this team. I think I've heard some people try and run Tenacity on Escoffier to try and buff the damage from, of course, Sandy and Miko, but I already have that on Chi-Chi, so that's going to end up being meaningless. Here's the thing. I have glazed C2 Xilonen quite a lot on this channel, primarily because of the busted Electro buff, but this time we're able to talk about the Cryo buff that gives Sandrone, and to some extent Chi-Chi, a very powerful crit damage buff. It's particularly huge on my Sandrone, as I haven't bothered to get her Sig, nor am I using some kind of crit weapon. When Snezhnaya drops, we're going to be getting a new Battle Pass weapon that is, of course, going to give us some crit rate as a substat, so we might have to revisit this later on. At the present moment, I have chosen to stick with Mailed Flower, a weapon with a very accessible passive. Now, not only do you get the passive if you trigger a reaction, which doesn't actually happen that much for Sandrone on this team because we normally have a Cryo Aura on enemies, but if you actually use her skill, that also does the trick. And like I mentioned earlier, Sandy famously uses her skill a lot, but that's exactly why you'll see in my gameplay I actually start with her skill, even though I don't actually have more than half of her overheat meter sorted out, because then I just start charge attacking and I get that 24% attack, and as well the 96 EM from that passive. So C2 Xilonen's plus 60% crit damage buff on a Sandy who isn't using a crit weapon does in fact turn out to be a pretty huge deal. Yes, I could just use Wolf's Gravestone too, but I seem to only be doing a smidge more DPS, even with the EM buff from C2 Miko. So, second, I think we're going to stick with Melflower. But yeah, thanks to that crit damage buff, I seem to be getting a 30k DPS spike compared to Escoffier. Now, this is R1 Xilonen, so no matter what happens, I am of course getting Red Shred and some damage percent on both Sandy and Miko. I am lazy though, so she is running Scroll, but the nature of this team does mean that I seem to be getting Cryo Scroll a lot more than Electro Scroll, so I get the feeling that's kind of meaningless. The Akasha seems to think that Stellar Conduct makes up around 90% of Sandy's DPS, which is in all likelihood correct. And on top of that, while we're thinking about the Akasha, it also seems to think that Stellar Conduct makes up about 57% of Miko's DPS, give or take. So yeah, that's kind of what we're playing with. So you'd think the strongest Sandy team I can make right now is Xilonen, Chi-Chi, and Miko.
Jeb is so wrong.
As it turns out, there is a surprising alternative that is ever so slightly stronger right now, and that's by swapping my C5 Chi-Chi with C6 Symphonist Iansan. It's interesting. One of Chi-Chi's buffs is that while her skill is active, everyone gets some Stellar Conduct percent. Everyone on the team. But it seems like the massive attack buff that Iansan gives is enough to make Sandy's damage go up by quite a fair bit. And even in the brief period of Miko on-field time, which can be longer if you EEQ like I do, that also seems to be enough for Iansan to be stronger than Chi-Chi. On top of that, I want to mention as well the way I am playing this team does end up with an Electro Scroll buff because we actually have both Miko and Iansan getting rid of the Cryo Aura, so there is that advantage as well. Because Sandrone hovers as she attacks, she can to some extent maintain Iansan's meter. Now, not as well as other characters like everyone who has Night Soul, Clorand, Skirk, but she's definitely not just standing there. Look, it's not perfect. We do actually have some brief moments of being under Iansan's threshold, but if you're using something like Miko or Sandy's ult, they're usually happening while Iansan's meter is near its maximum, so I'm able to enjoy things like 200k ult hits from Miko and 700k ult hits from Sandy. one more team variation that I want to talk about, because if you've been paying attention to the story of Genshin, especially during the Nocry and actually Fontaine sections nowadays, it's clear to me that Sandrone and Columbina, let's just say, quite fond of each other. Naturally, we'd like to play them together. Well, Sandrone would like Electro on her team so that she can do Stellar Conduct memes. So if that's with Columbina, well, of course we'd end up with Lunar Charge as well. Thus, running Benefa makes the most sense. After all, it's synergy at its finest. But here's the thing. My initial thought was to run Chi-Chi to keep Cryo Resonance going. But it turns out that running double Cryo results in an overwhelming Cryo Aura that actively prevents the Lunar Charge Thunderclouds from showing up, which of course pretty much destroys the direct Lunar Charge damage coming from Benefa. So what's the solution? Well, you could just not bring double Cryo and that mainly does the trick. So you can bring someone like Nicole and there you go. Alternatively, you could run an overwhelming Electro Aura with double Electro. That way, Sandy can trigger the Stellar Conduct field, and Columbina can be the one who triggers the Lunar Charge Thunderclouds. Thus comes the big question, who do we bring? Naturally, the answer is of course the illustrious Yae Miko, who definitely makes the team very straightforward to play. But an alternative, especially if you have significantly lower investment on Miko, is C6 Beidou. C6 Beidou can provide the Electro and Cryo Res Shred, and that will affect both the Stellar Conduct damage from Sandrone and of course the Lunar Charge damage coming from Benefa. I still find Beidou a bit strange to play even with her normal gameplay loop, especially because her C6 has a hilariously short range, but if you happen to have Flame Forged Insight, for example, from the Natland Summertime event, that does seem to help a lot in getting Beidou's ult back pretty damn quickly. But at least with Miko on the team, my R2 Benefa R1 Columbina results in a smidge more DPS than the Triple Cryo Escoffier team, so it's definitely an option. One of the big questions, if you happen to be a C6 Miko main, that's right, I'm once again catering to us C6 Miko players, is should you use a crit hat or should you use an attack hat? And spoiler alert, they are in fact very, very similar, to the point where I would argue that they are within the margin of error. So I guess pick whichever one you have better substats in. For my testing, I believe both of them are pretty much the same with regards to their substats. I suppose the attack hat is a 5-liner with oops or crit, but there is one role in ER, which one could argue could be a little bit useless, but it's close enough. It'll basically do the job. And on top of that, just keep in mind that the crit rate on my attack build is a little bit lower, so I guess that does point more in the favor of the attack build, I guess, because it is still pretty damn strong. I do want to point out that the normal Electro hits coming out of the crit build is in fact a little bit stronger than the normal hits coming out of the attack build. I'm of course talking about the Electro hits, whereas the Stellar Conduct hits coming out of the attack build are a little bit stronger than of course the Stellar Conduct hits coming out of the crit build. So that's kind of what we're working with, I think, for the most part. So either way, they're pretty much more or less the same. I did also try using an EM hat that does seem to be a little worse than a crit hat, so I guess at the end of the day, whichever one has the best substats, you can actually use all three, either of all three, and you're pretty much good to go. Okay, one last thing, I swear. Is Miko's ult a DPS loss? More importantly, which version of using Miko's ult is actually the best? Because I'd say, when it comes to the illustrious Yae Miko, there are in fact 3 ways that you can incorporate her ult. First way is to just not use it at all. Second way is to potentially save some time in the rotation. The third way is to just go all the way. Now obviously I will speak from the C6 Miko perspective, so things like the C6 plus 200% crit damage on Stellar Conduct damage for Miko, and of course the C4 plus 100 ult% is going to play a role in all of this. Before the testing, I figured it'd be best to stick with something that's straightforward like the triple cryo Escoffier team, because C2 Xilonen does heavily favor using Miko's ult, and Nahida's Shrine of Maya would heavily favor running QEEE. The rotation that I opted for was Miko into Escoffier, into Chi-Chi, into Sandy with 3 charge attacks and an ult, just somehow, and then of course repeating. Miko would always start off with just EEE in the first rotation, but aside from that she would do whichever version of using her ult that I was testing. Now from my testing alone, EEE QEEE was actually noticeably worse than not using her ult at all, which was actually a little bit worse than running EEE Q somehow. I think in this team, the biggest problem is that Chi-Chi's skill up time is only 15 seconds, and that only covers the first 3 EEEs from Miko, and then any additional ones wouldn't get the Stellar Conduct % buff, so that's why EEEQ ended up being better than QEEE as well. With that in mind, I suspect and hope Odette might change everything, as her buff, if I understand it correctly, actually lasts for 20 seconds, and if my reading of the ability is correct, we could end up just using Odette's ult and then just swapping as well, maybe. I don't know. Which would potentially cause her Stellar Conduct stacks to actually be spread amongst everyone else over time. So by the time we get to Miko's part of the rotation, she would actually have all 4 stacks, which currently means plus 60 Stellar Conduct %, which by the way is a little bit more than Chi-Chi's skill right now. So all of this to say, I think I'm going to have to revisit this next patch if I remember to. And with that, I think that'll do it for this video. The Miko ult stuff is probably going to be a little bit different for some other teams, especially the ones involving C2 Xilonen, because that C2 reducing the cooldown of Miko's ult does kind of fix the Chi-Chi problem that I just mentioned via ultra fast rotation. So, there we go. My Sandrone build is still rather cooked. I'm still farming a better attack sand or cup. On Miko, I'm still using my 2-piece build, since if my Sandy doesn't have a build that is quote-unquote perfect yet, there is no universe where I would be able to have another super conduct set to use on Miko that's better than my top 2% generalist build, so I think I'll stick with that. So the farming for that will continue until Snezhnaya drops, and then suddenly there's the support set that I would be farming for Chi-Chi, since I think in all likelihood it's probably going to be more useful than Tenacity. Or hell, maybe I'll use the support set on Odette. That makes perfect sense too. We'll just have to see. Anyway, let me know what you think about all this in the comments below. How are you playing your Sandrone, and what do you feel about her? Are you actually enjoying her these days? Because she is, of course, an on-fielder, so she does have to be enjoyable to actually be worth getting. Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, hope you guys enjoyed. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact content, and as always, until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Nothing lasts